Appreciate Kyle's kind words. All glory goes to God, as always. I appreciate his encouragement and the way that he's welcomed me ever since we showed ourselves up here in Kentucky. And it is always a blessing to be with this church. This church has a wonderful reputation. Y'all are so hospitable. Y'all love the Word. And I love y'all's youth. I think that every single time I come here. The greatest compliment I can give a group is that your VBS reminds me of the VBS we did in Salem, Oregon when I was there, because that was the best VBS we ever did, I've ever seen anywhere, and y'all's is rivaling it already. So I just really appreciate the work and the attention that's gone into this, and I'm just excited that we get to open up our Bibles together. So thank you for this invitation, and I'd invite you to open up your Bibles, if you will, to Exodus chapter 13, which is actually where we're going to start. I know our primary text is in Exodus 14, but as I say all the time, context determines the content. And so for us to understand what's happening in 14, it's going to be very important for us to understand what is happening in 13. I do not like just lecturing. I never like just lecturing. So my encouragement, my request is please lob as many questions and comments as you possibly can, because that's how we grow, is together, when we're all giving input and looking at the Word together. And there are many, many, many here that are sitting here tonight who are far better students and wiser than me, that have insights that this group needs to hear as we discuss. So as we're here, we're beginning in Exodus chapter 13, which is actually going to be the section regarding the Passover. And what I want you to notice as you look through this text, we're not going to read all of this text, but I want you to focus on several different sections. I want you to look at verse 3. Moses is going to say to the people, "Remember this day when you came out of Egypt, out of the place of slavery, for the Lord brought you here by the strength of His hand." Then when you look down at verse 9, "Let it serve as a sign for you on your hand, as a reminder on your forehead, that the Lord's instruction may be in your mouth. For the Lord brought you out of Egypt with a strong hand." And then finally, we're going to see in verse 14, "In the future, when your son asks you, 'What does all of this mean?' you say to him, 'By the strength of His hand, the Lord has brought us out of Egypt.'" 3 different times this is going to be emphasized as they are being given instructions on how they are to observe the Passover, and the purpose with which they are observing the Passover is going to be this focus on the reason that any of this is happening. The reason that you are here is not because of what you have done, but because of what God has done on your account. So whenever you see red, this is when I stop talking and I expect other people to start talking. These are going to be our thought questions. And so I wanted to get the juices flowing right off the bat. As we talk about the Passover, what is the driving force and what is the driving focus of the Passover? As you read over these texts, what was the Passover supposed to teach the people? And from memory or from things you're reading through in the text, just bring out things that the Passover was supposed to teach the people and remind them of. All right, we had several. Start here.
Remember the day the Lord took them out of bondage.
To take them back in their memories of when they exited slavery, right? When God brought them out of this place. Absolutely. Cody? Right, and the same thing. That all of this is hinged on what God did for these people, right? This is not a commemoration of this great triumph that they accomplished. Look at what we did when we circled together and roused our troops and united as one, and we overthrew Egypt. That's not what the Passover is about at all. Everything about the Passover points them back to the deliverance that God gave the people and His strength that He demonstrated throughout all of this. And so I want us to have this discussion, though, because they are going to be delivered by God's own strength, and we have very similar things that we do when we come together. In fact, it was during the Passover that Jesus instituted something else. What is it that we come together and remember our deliverance from when we gather as Christians? What's that called? Obviously, the Lord's Supper. We partake of this every single week, and that is to remind us of God's great deliverance through Egypt. And what's a struggle with this sometimes is it feels like we live in a world that is very pendulum related when it comes to works and when it comes to faith, right? And we feel like we're having this conversation with James, you show me your faith apart from your works, I'll show you my faith by my works, and there's only two camps and that's it. But I want us to recognize when you look at this, when we talk about and when we emphasize God's strength, because we're going to be doing this a lot this evening, of what God did for the people. Never once, when we highlight God's deliverance and God's strength, does it negate the condition of our obedience towards God. So I've said this many times in my life, and I like putting it this way. Salvation is not by merit in a way that we earn it on commission, but salvation is never without condition. It's not on commission, but it is never without condition. And so I want us to think about this before we get into this text, because think about the people that are going to be brought out of Egypt. What are things that they had to do regarding the Passover if they were going to be brought out of Egypt? Just things from memory that they had to do as the people of God. Right, we're looking at the picture right here. And in fact, it was told to them, anyone that does not have the blood over their doorposts, what was going to happen that night? The angel of death, right, was going to enter and was going to slaughter the firstborn. And it was going to happen to anyone's house that was not covered. So we can ask this question. Now, this seems silly. I think this is rhetorical. Did the people of Israel deliver themselves by their own strength when they painted the blood above the door? Absolutely not. God is the one who brought them deliverance, but it was not without condition. They are submitting to the will of God, and in submission to His will, it is God who brings them out of this place. And so there's all kinds of things that they had to do. They were required to observe this and to apply the blood. They were required to leave, and they were required to follow the cloud as they were called to do. And yet in all of this, they were not capable of saving themselves. They were entirely dependent upon God bringing them out. But this is a very important conversation for us to have, because so many people get this twisted in our religious culture today. If we emphasize obedience, some feel like we are taking away from God's glory, which we are not. It is only by God's deliverance that we can be here today, number one. But in other instances, some feel like because we have obeyed, we have somehow done this ourselves. We have not done this ourselves. Just like Israel, were it not for the work of God, they would have still been in Egypt. They never would have left. And were it not for the blood of Christ, the Lamb of God that we just sang about, every single one of us would still be in slavery to our sins as well. So I just wanted to start the class off here. So as we go forward, we're going to be focusing a lot on what God has done for the people. Do not mistake that to put words I'm not saying in my mouth to suggest that God does not have conditions that He expects for us to follow. Any thoughts about that or questions before we continue on? This is just where I wanted a baseline before we keep going tonight. That's right. Right. So a lot of times it comes down to how we define works, right? And so whenever Paul writes the word works, he's talking about works of merit from the Mosaic Law. And that's why he's so clear in the book of Romans that we are not saved under a basis of works of merit under the law. We are saved on the basis of faith. But what's amazing is when you look at Romans, how Romans is bookended, and so many people miss this because they think James is at odds with the book of Romans. I was having a debate this last week with a man who runs his own ministry who makes the claim that James wrote the book of James before Acts 15, and so James was just untaught and he was immature, and so we can throw out everything in the book of James because he didn't understand what he was writing yet. That's not at all it, because the way Paul discusses faith, he bookends it in Romans 1, verse 6, and all the way in Romans 16 at the very end, for the obedience of faith. Genuine faith, real faith, always works, always obeys, and that's what Hebrews defines faith for us in Hebrews chapter 11, that those who want to draw near to God must believe that A, He exists, and B, that He is a rewarder of those who diligently seek Him. Now, do we earn our salvation when we obey Him? Everyone say no. No, right? We are unworthy servants. But simply because God places conditions on that salvation, it does not mean we've earned it, but it does mean that we will not be saved if we do not adhere to those conditions. Just like spreading the blood over the doorposts. Yes? Right. 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 Yes. Right. That's right. Yes. Yes. Right. No. Right. I'm genuine. I cannot agree with anything you said more. That was absolutely foundational to this argument. I had a debate with another gentleman in a coffee shop in Nicholasville a couple of weeks ago, and he found out who we were and what we believe, and he was arguing that we are false teachers because we suggest that baptism is necessary for salvation, and that's a work, that we're doing essentially what Adam and Eve did in trying to cover themselves, and it was unacceptable. God had to cover them, and so I said, so baptism is not essential for salvation. Why? He said, because it's something that you do. I said, okay, well then how are we saved? He said, well, you have to say this prayer. And I said, isn't that something you do? And he struggled a lot with that. He did, well, I guess it is something you do, but it's a different thing you do. That one's okay, this one's not. And so, but I digress. But that's exactly where the crux of this argument goes. But
Grace is God's conditional, unmerited favor.
right.
Like if I asked you to come get this $100 bill,
Right.
got it. You didn't deserve it.
Not a bit.
You didn't do anything for me, but you had to meet the conditions.
That's exactly right. 100%. I've always loved that illustration. I can write someone a check for $1 million. Don't cash that if I write that, but I can write someone a check for $1 million. They have access to it, but what do they have to do to actually have access to it? They got to go get it, and they got to cash it. And if you don't cash it or you throw it away, you don't got it anymore, right? Okay, so that being said, God very clearly expects Israel to submit to His will and obey Him, and those that will not, very clearly in this journey, as we'll see, they're not going to enter into God's promised rest, right? Not because they earned it, but because they were unwilling to meet God's conditions. That being said, we want to focus now on what God does for Israel going forward. So really good thoughts. I really appreciate, y'all really got the ball rolling there, so I expect lots of discussion now. We got the ice broken. All right, let's look at chapter 13. I want you to look at verse 17. It is so easy sometimes to overlook these small things because we want to jump into the parting of the sea. We want to get into the big stuff, and we overlook the small details. Sometimes these are where the really sneaky important lessons are. Can I get someone to read verses 17 and 18 for us of chapter 13?
Pharaoh let the people go. God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. God said, lest the people change their mind when they see war and return to Egypt. God led the people around by the way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea.
Okay. When the people get to the Red Sea, as we're going to see in a little bit, everyone thought this was a mistake, right? The people thought this was a mistake. And they think, Moses, is it because there just wasn't enough graves in Egypt that you brought us out here? Is that why we're here, right? They think that God has made a mistake. Pharaoh thinks that God has made a mistake. It says that Pharaoh certainly thinks that the people were boxed in. They're trapped, right? Lo and behold, Pharaoh didn't know this was a trap for him, not for the people. It was a trap, just not for them. But from the very beginning, this was God's plan to bring them to the edge of the sea. That was God's plan, and I want you to realize why it was God's plan. There was a faster way to get them out of there. There was a arguably better way to get them out of there. But look at what the text says. They were not going to go this direction that was nearby because God said, the people will change their minds and return to Egypt if they face war. Had these people matured at all yet as God's people? Had they been tested? Had they been organized? God knew what they could endure. And the fact that God brought them to the edge of the water was actually a sign of God's grace. I want us to think about this for a second. I think sometimes in our life, we can end up in a really difficult situation. And our first inclination sometimes is to ask the why me, God question, right? Why did you bring me here? Why did you bring me to this place? And we're really quick to grumble and complain just like Israel did. But what Israel didn't recognize is it was God's grace that they were there and not in this other place. Because this would have been far worse than where God actually led them. We don't get to see things in, God vision, right? We have to have the benefit of looking back, and hindsight is 20/20 is what they say. Many times we don't see God's providence until we look back. I remember when we were first leaving Texas, that was a really difficult situation before coming up here. And we struggled with this why question. And ever since then, though, we have been a part of the healthiest, most wonderful work that I've ever been a part of, with strong leadership that's helped me and my children and my wife to grow. And we've grown. And where we came from, over the next several years, there was all kinds of upheaval and issues and terrible, terrible things that happened that would have been devastating to my wife and I and to our children. And I look at that and I look back at all the times I grumbled and complained about the hard thing that we have to go through, and now I look back at that hard thing and I realize that was God's grace in my life. That He wasn't having me go through this thing, I was going through a different thing instead. And I think sometimes we can forget that. And I'm always reminded of 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 11 through 13, that no temptation is uncommon to man, right? But anyone can say, that this is too much for me to bear, but we recognize that's not true. Because the Scripture tells us that God will always provide a way of escape. I like to say, if God will bring you to it, He will bring you through it, right? If God will bring you to it, He will bring you through it. And that's what all of this is about. God is setting this up to demonstrate to Israel that this is not about their strength, but it's about His grace. And I think that's also why God sends them this way, because if the people miraculously fought and fended off the Egyptian army and went to war with them, who would they have a temptation to boast in? Themselves, right? Which one of the Israelites do you think was tempted to boast that they had anything to do with splitting a sea in half? Nothing, right? God put them in a situation that there was nothing that they could do to save themselves. The only one who could receive glory for these things was God. All right, so let's fast forward a little bit and let's go to chapter 14. Because all of this is going to be a surprise to Pharaoh. All of this is going to be a surprise to the people, but none of this is going to be a surprise to God. And what we see in this text is, well, there are certainly circumstances that are beyond our abilities. We need to recognize that there's also circumstances that are beyond our understanding. Can I get someone else to read verses 1 through 4 of Exodus 14? All right. God knows exactly what's about to happen. God knows exactly how this is going to play out. But that's not the case for Israel, and that's certainly not the case for Pharaoh. Because when you look at what the text says, everyone's thinking everyone is wrong in their understanding of the current circumstances, right? Pharaoh's wrong because Pharaoh thinks the people are boxed in. This is sudden victory for him, right? Flawless victory. I don't know if you ever played Mortal Kombat growing up, but that's what Pharaoh's got in his mind here, right? That they've got the mountains on each side, they've got the sea in front of them. They just walked into a dead end, and all he has to do is come through and sweep them up and bring them all back to Egypt with him. That's what's going on in Pharaoh's mind. That's the circumstances. The Israelite circumstances are way different, as we're going to read in just a moment. We can read ahead for just a minute. When you look down at verse 11, this is how the Israelites perceive their circumstances. They look at Moses and say, "Is it because there's no graves in Egypt that you've taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Isn't this what we told you in Egypt? Leave us alone so that we can serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." I love how backsliding they are so quickly. We told you to leave us alone. What were they just doing before this? But they were, thwarting and robbing Egypt and taking all of their gold and their treasures with them as God was delivering them. Do you think any one of them with gold and silver laden on their backs was leaving Egypt going, "I really hate this," right? "This is terrible. I can't believe we're finally leaving." No, they were so excited. Until the first line of provocation, and all of a sudden they're like, "Moses, we hate you. We always have, really, if we're being honest. We don't like that you brought us here, and you brought us from bad to worse. It would have been better if we just stayed in bad." All of them are wrong regarding their circumstances. God's wisdom is far beyond theirs. And God's wisdom is far beyond our own as well. And so I want to just ask this thought question and kick this around for a minute. And so the thought question we want to ask is, in what ways do we doubt God like Israel because of a lack of our understanding? Sometimes doubt is rooted in different things, but in this case, their doubt and their fear is rooted in their lack of their understanding. How can we be guilty of the same thing? Maybe we're not saying I want to go back to Egypt, but how can we be guilty of the same thing like Israel? Instead of aligning ourselves with God's will, we want to think God's throwing himself behind our will to do it our way. My dad's favorite verses in all of Scripture are Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Trust in the Lord with all of your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. But in all of your ways acknowledge him and he will make your path straight. Brothers and sisters, that is a whole lot easier said than done. Because we think we've got it figured out sometimes, and that's what sends our faith into a downward spiral because it isn't going according to the way we think it needs to go. Kyle.
God's commanded us to, as husbands, sacrifice ourselves for our wives, as wives submit ourselves for husbands. And we don't see how that's going to get us where we feel like we need to be.
Right.
We don't like where we're at right now. And so we begin to doubt maybe God doesn't really know what he's talking about.
Right. And I want to lean into that a little bit because that's with so many cultural issues, right? Our culture, our society says one thing about how marriage should be, or how marriage should be approached, or how children should be, or how sexuality should be, or how a lot of these different issues that are hot button issues should be approached. And so many people try to take the will of man and kind of blend it with this like weird cheese grater, and they try to bring it all together and have this Tex-Mex and have kind of God's will, kind of society's will, and kind of fit it all together. And it doesn't work like that, right? It's God's way or it's errant. It's not a mix of both. It's God's way or it's errant. And we have to be willing to not be so proud to align ourselves with our culture in the world and say the wisdom of man is greater than the wisdom of God. I know God says this, but this is really what I think. And so this is what I'm going to do. Because when we do that, we're going to mess things up. Yes, ma'am. I love that. Get out of God's way and let him do his job. It reminds me of something my dad used to tell me, which was a big ouch. And he used to say, you need to get off God's throne and let him get back on. And you have a father telling a 17-year-old boy that, it hurts, right? But that's exactly what I was doing. I wanted to be in charge. I wanted to be king. I needed to get out of God's way and let him do his job. I love that. Very good. Any other comments on this or questions? Or
Sometimes we get the idea that God works on our time.
That's right.
God don't work on our time. Sometimes God's 3 days, 3 years, 3,000
Yep.
years ahead.
Yep. That's right.
God will handle.
We're going to talk about waiting on the Lord in just a few minutes, so hold on to that thought. And I love me some Frank Sinatra, just like any other cultured person does. But that is the most anti-biblical song ever. I Did It My Way, isn't it? It is the most anti-biblical song. I did it my way, and whoa, this crescendo, and my way gets me here, right? That's where my way gets me. I get that he's not talking on a spiritual level, but you can make spiritual application from it. So very good. Love that comment. All right, continuing on. Let's surge forward, and let's look at this narrative. Let's look at the main section of our text here. We're going to summarize this because essentially, Pharaoh gets his cohorts together, and they kind of have this aha moment, right? They are left in a dilapidated Egypt with the livestock gone and the people having lost their firstborn in darkness, and everything is a mess. And now all of their back work, all of the people that built their society, they let walk out and rob them on the way out, right? And after Pharaoh finishes his grief, and that's the only reason I believe he let them go, is he was so grieved by the loss of his son that he kind of lost his way for a moment. He lost his proud, defiant arrogance for long enough for them to get out, but it wasn't long lasting. Because he finally says, what in the world have we done? And so he gathers all of his troops. He takes 600 of his best chariots, and they rush after the people. And as they approach, as we heard in that very handsome voiced Eliab, I don't know who that guy was, but man, he was awesome. This dust and cloud of smoke rising and coming upon the people, you can imagine the fear that took place with these people. They are certain that this is the end for them, right? They've got mountains on both sides. They've got water in front of them. There is nowhere that they can go. They cannot outrun chariots. You've got 1 million plus people with children, with supplies that have to try and navigate and get away from Egypt. And this army that's chased after them, they are certain that they are going to die. But I want us to notice a couple of things here as we look at this narrative. Number one is that Pharaoh is going to harden his heart toward God. After everything that he's been through, he still puts on his armor and goes after these people after they had been let go. What should Pharaoh have learned at this point by now? What should he have learned by now?
Don't tempt the God.
Right. Okay. Is anyone a college football fan here?
Yeah.
I think my favorite thing that people chanted in the last decade when Alabama was at its superpower, when Nick Saban was just cleaning house before people started getting paid legitimately to play football. Sorry, did I say that? What would people chant when they won some big game? We want Bama, right? And then they'd come in all hot and excited. I remember USC doing all this stuff. They were getting ready to play Alabama. You know what the final score of that game was when USC finally played Alabama after chanting that the week before? It's like 63-7. Alabama, by the way. Just pulverized them. Now imagine if you were scheduled to play Alabama in their height, their superpower, every single week. And every single week, the score was 63-7, 63-5, 63-3, right? Once you get to week 6, week 7, what are you starting to figure out? What can you not do? We don't want Bama, right? What should Pharaoh have learned at this point? His gods are no match for Yahweh. His gods are no match for the God of Israel. He has gone to the ring, toe-to-toe with God, over and over and over and over and over again. And every time, Pharaoh was absolutely humiliated. And his gods were humiliated. And yet, he suits up his armor and he goes after these people. He's learned nothing from this experience. And it reminds me a little bit of Gamaliel's advice. He would have benefited from living several centuries later and listening to Gamaliel. You guys remember what Gamaliel told the Pharisees who were wanting to put the apostles to death right at the beginning? He said, time out, guys, right? If this is God's will, and we find ourselves in opposition to this isn't going to go well for us, right? It's going to happen either way. If it's not God's will, it'll fizzle out, just like all these others have. But we can find ourselves set against God. Pharaoh did not learn this lesson. And he thinks, I'm going to go toe-to-toe one more time with God, and it's going to actually end up costing him his entire army for doing so. But we focus so much on Pharaoh's hard heart that I think we miss that Pharaoh's not the only one with a hard heart in this text. Because Pharaoh, we look at this and maybe understand, right? He's steeped in idolatry. He's so rooted in this. He cannot let go of his power and his arrogance. That makes sense. But what about Israel? What have they also just witnessed week after week after week after week? What have they seen? They've seen the plagues. They've seen God's glory. They've seen God's power. And God took the prominent, dominant superpower of the day and made them look like they were Miss McGillicuddy's School for Girls playing Alabama, right? Just destroyed them. And yet they get to some water and they think, well, this is too much for God. They, after seeing God turn the entire Nile River into blood, they somehow think that God has brought them out here to die and that this is too much for God to be able to handle. The people's hearts are hardened. They should have learned better by now. Not just Pharaoh, because they are on the receiving end of God's grace in all of this. God has been delivering them and bringing them out of slavery and doing miraculous wonders and signs. How could they possibly see this and not recognize that God can and will do it again? But it's really easy for us to point the finger and say, naughty Israel, those people were so stupid, they didn't figure anything out. Can we be a lot like Israel with this? Where we've seen God's deliverance time and time and time again in our lives, but we come to some kind of a position in our lives where we feel a little trapped. We feel like we've reached a dead end and we think, this is it. God, who brought me through all these other really difficult situations in the past, somehow has no control or ability to do anything now. I think there's really two things I want us to talk about for a second that this really comes down to. But we need to believe that God is both willing and able, right? And I think Israel struggled with both of those things. We'll look at that in just a second. But let's talk about that for a moment with us, because we can be just like Israel. How is it that we can doubt God's strength and His deliverance? Would 10 minutes? Okay. How can we do the same? By doubting God as being willing or able to do so. Yes? Okay. Sure. Right. 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 And at the root of what you just said is really what's at the root of so many situations of doubt, where people have doubted, why would God love me or care for me, right? I think about when all the disciples are in a boat and the water is pouring in. These are professional fishermen who think they're about to die, by the way, so this was a serious storm. And they rouse Jesus, who's sleeping through all of that. And their question is, don't you care that we're about to die? They didn't think that Jesus cared enough. He wasn't acting because he must not care. And we struggle with that sometimes. But what does Peter remind us of in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 7? Cast your anxieties upon him, because why? He cares for you. We're going to look at that word cast in just a moment. We're going to tie it with God's ability to do so. But if we doubt God's compassion and his care for us, we will doubt his willingness to do the things that he's promised to do. And we can't do that. Even Jesus reminds us of this all in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6. And Jesus makes these arguments from the lesser to the greater. When Jesus is dealing with anxiety about our necessities, food and clothing, what does Jesus do every single time? He says, okay, let's look at some things. Let's look at the birds. What do the birds do for themselves? The answer is what? Nothing. God makes sure they're fed. Are you not of more value than they are? Then he does the same thing with the wildflowers. And God's trying to highlight, and Jesus is trying to highlight there in his Sermon on the Mount, God cares about you. And if God cares about you, you don't have to worry about this stuff. God will follow through on his promises. Sometimes we doubt that God really will because we're not sure he loves us, but he does. But then the other part is sometimes we doubt whether God's able. And we think, well, that's kind of a stretch. Touch your toes, preacher. You're stretching there. God can do anything, right? Okay. That same word for cast that Peter uses is also used in Psalm 55 and verse 22. and it means to transfer weight. So I want to give an illustration here. Does anyone know Leighton Curtis at Danville? I feel like everyone knows Leighton. He's crazy. Leighton is this old coot who has used up all of his 9 lives. He's part feline. And he's probably pushing 90 at this point, but he's 124 pounds dripping wet 90. And he is one of the most incredible, godly men I've ever known. But I don't invite him to moving parties, right? Can you imagine if you saw 124-pound, 90-year-old Leighton Curtis trying to lift one end of a hide-a-bed? If you saw that, what would anyone in this room do? You would run over to take that from him because you know he cannot bear that by himself. Now, what would happen if Leighton said, no, I got it, right? What's going to eventually happen as he's trying to move that? He's going to get hurt, right? He's going to get squashed. And it's because of his pride that he thought it would be better for him to move it than to transfer that weight to somebody else. I want you to think about this. This is what we do to God. We say, God, it's better for me to deal with this. I'm better equipped and able to handle this than you are, and so I'm not going to give this to you. I'm not going to let you take this. I'm not going to let you fight this battle. I'm reminded of Mark 9, the gentleman who wanted Jesus to heal his son and said, if you can, and Jesus goes, excuse me, I don't think I heard you right. If you can, all things are possible for him who believes. And he says, I do believe. You finish it? Help my unbelief. I relate to that. I understand that. So, we look at the Lord's response. We're going to fly through this because we got 5 minutes, okay? He tells them to do 3 things. First of all, he says, do not be afraid, which seems ridiculous, right? But if this were by their own strength, they would have every reason to be afraid. They needed to be reminded of who was in control. And the fact that they feared demonstrated that they assumed God was no longer in control. But God was. They were commanded, do not be afraid. They needed to, secondly, stand firm. Don't run, don't panic, don't compromise. It's easy to start strong, but it's hard to stay strong in endurance. They needed to learn to wait on the Lord. There's a passage in Isaiah that is going to be very similar to verse 14 where it says, the Lord will fight for you. You must be quiet. And what Isaiah talks about in Isaiah 30 is talking about quiet confidence in God. Wait and let God do His thing. Get out of the way and let God do His work. And that's one of the hardest things because to us it seems like everything's collapsing in on us. But God knows what's about to happen. And so He tells them, finally, that they must see the Lord's salvation. To take their eyes off of Egypt, take their eyes off of Pharaoh, and put their eyes back on God. That's when we get in trouble, is when we take our eyes off of Jesus. When did Peter sink in Matthew 14 as he's walking on the water? When he took his eyes off of Jesus and put them on his circumstances, put them on what was immediately surrounding him. And that's what happens to us. We get so consumed with what's surrounding us and we take our eyes off of Jesus. And that's when we get into trouble. We need to remember what Hebrews 12, 1 through 2 tells us, to fix our eyes on Jesus, to lay aside these things that so easily entangle us, right? I don't know if y'all sing this hymn, but there's a hymn called Turn Your Eyes on Jesus. I love that song. Love the words of that song. It reminds us of everything we're dealing with here. Because the Lord was going to fight for them. A term we're going to see all throughout Scripture, by the way. Over and over said to God's people and of God's people, and reminding them of the God that they serve, the God who fights behind them. And so we don't have time to do this discussion question, but on your own time, think about the balance between God's deliverance and our responsibility. Is this just passively waiting and doing nothing, or is there something that God calls for us to do as we wait for Him? In conclusion, I want to get to our end here. We finally have the moment where God splits the sea. And as opposed to what TV tells you, Moses did not just stick his staff out and smack the water and the waters went real quick. God drove this all night by a wind. And what looked like a problem was actually a platform. What looked like a problem was actually a platform. A platform for God's glory. 3 times it's going to be said in this text, I will receive glory and they will know that I am the Lord. What God was about to do was going to bamboozle every single person that was standing on that shore, both Egyptian and Israelite alike. And what both perceived as certain death is actually the thing that was their pathway to life. I believe that's part of why Moses equates the passing through the Red Sea to our coming to Christ. Most people highlight that this is about baptism, and certainly water is a part of that, and that's present. But I think part of that is this: what looked as certain death and looked like a certain conquest for God and God's people ended up being the very thing that brought life. The cross looked like a defeat. The cross looked like it ended in death, but it resulted in life and for everyone who would pass through that cross. The same thing with the sea that God parted into. There's a lot here. We need to learn to turn our problems into platforms for God's glory. And we're completely out of time, but in application, the people sing the song of Moses in Exodus 15. They finally, for a minute, right, learn their lesson. And we're just like Israel. We have to be reminded all the time of who God is, of His strength. And in application at the end, we just need to remember that there are certain things that we could have never done on our own. God had to do it for us. God delivered us from sin and death through the work of Jesus Christ. That's right.
How much more will He do for us?
That's exactly right.
After His Son was sacrificed.
That's exactly right. That is exactly right. And that's what Romans 5 is all about, right? We have this confidence. Yes, brother. Did you have your hand up? Okay. All right. We are out of time. Read 2 Corinthians 1, 8 through 10. I might read that for part of our invitation tonight. We'll throw that in there. But any last thoughts or comments before we close our time this evening? All right. I really appreciate you all very much. Let's let the kids in.